Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the Politics Guys with your hosts, Jay Carson and Michael Baranowski.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is journalist and researcher Dr. Sarah Kendzior. She's a columnist for Canada's Globe and Mail, and her work has appeared in multiple national outlets here in the U.S., including Politico, Slate, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. She's also the author of the best-selling essay collection, The View from Flyover Country. Dr. Kendzior has a PhD in anthropology, with her academic work focusing on the authoritarian states of the former Soviet Union and how the internet affects political mobilization, self-expression, and trust. She also has an always fascinating Twitter account and was named one of the 100 people you should be following on Twitter to make sense of global events by Foreign Policy magazine. Sarah Kendzior, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You know, I've interviewed a bunch of academics on the show at this point, but you are actually the first anthropologist I've talked with. And so first off, I guess I was just wondering, how do you go from a doctorate in anthropology to a career in political journalism?
Well, it helps when both industries kind of implode. It's not necessarily a choice, but a reaction. I actually worked in journalism before I went and got my PhD in anthropology. My first job was at the New York Daily News. I felt that in journalism, I couldn't do the kind of work that I wanted. This was, during a recession for the media economy, and I liked doing longer pieces. I liked exploring topics that weren't necessarily popular, and among one of my interests was the former Soviet, Central Asia. And so when I went and got my PhD, I had the opportunity to do that kind of in-depth research. I ran into some other obstacles in that the main country I was interested in, Uzbekistan, I was no longer allowed to visit because of a massacre by the government of civilians that led to it being closed off from the West. And so what I ended up studying was how authoritarian regimes and their opponents use the internet in order to, practice political dissent or to crack down on political dissent, which obviously became inadvertently useful this year when examining the U.S. election. And so, after I finished my PhD, I'd already been writing, doing some blog stuff and some freelancing, and ended up being recruited by Al Jazeera English to write about things, and then recruited by other publications, and it just sort of went from there.
So do you think that anthropologists maybe look at the world of politics differently from most other political analysts? I mean, typically they have backgrounds in, political science, economics, history, that sort of thing. And so you're kind of unique in that regard. And so I'm wondering if you think there are any insights that an anthropology background bring.
Yeah, I think the main difference is that we have more of a qualitative approach versus a quantitative approach. I mean, there are some anthropologists who do rely more on quantitative data, but, at most we tend to combine the two. I think that, we have a tendency to not take things for granted, to want to see things firsthand. A lot of our field work is very long term, where we focus on one area or one subject for years and see how it develops over time, whereas I think other, disciplines don't necessarily do that. One thing I think is interesting is there have been other anthropologists who transitioned to journalism, and I think what it gives you is kind of a keen eye for bullshit. Like, Gillian Tett, who writes for the Wall Street Journal, was an anthropologist like me who studied Central Asia like me, and she predicted the 2008 financial crisis. And so I think anthropology gives you this, a bit more of an instinct to look at patterns and broader trends, and to kind of, see things that may be coming through shifts in political culture rather than things that can be tracked through quantitative data.
In addition to being different because you're an anthropologist and there aren't a lot doing political analysis, another thing that sets you apart, I think, from a lot of people I've talked to, and just generally a lot of people who look at politics, is that, like me, you're not a coastal elite. I mean, both St. Louis in your case and Cincinnati where I live, they're often called in a derogatory way flyover country. And after the election of Donald Trump, there was a lot that was made in the media about how coastal elites don't get people who live in flyover country. And of course, many of those people voted for Donald Trump. And I'm wondering if you agree with this. And also, I suppose, if you think being in flyover country gives you maybe a different perspective on politics.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, wealthy people on the coast don't understand what our lives are like here, but I also think they don't understand the lives of non-wealthy people living near them on the coast. I think there's more of a general blindness. One of the main things they don't get, though, about, basically everything between the coasts is that, we live in cities. You and I live in cities, and I'm guessing that your city mostly voted for Hillary Clinton, much as St. Louis did. And, I'm guessing your city, from what I know, is, a city with a substantial non-white population. And the way that the media tends to portray our part of the country is as, white, mostly male, manufacturing or other industrial workers, whereas in reality, our cities are quite diverse. There's a gulf, I think, between lifestyle of rural and urban. You also find that same gulf in the coasts themselves. And, there's a lot of stereotyping. I do think that, I just came back from Berkeley, so I sort of saw in the bubble for a second. I do think that, the life of people in St. Louis or Cincinnati is, more typical, to the lives of most Americans. I don't think it makes us more or less truly American. I don't buy into that narrative at all. But I do find it disturbing that the media tends to just disregard us, have no interest in us whatsoever, unless it happens to fit into some sort of election narrative or other, politically convenient narrative.
Yeah. I mean, there was talk certainly right after the election that the media would change or try to do something better, more coverage to that sort of thing. I haven't gotten the sense that that's really, there's been much follow through on that. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that the media has started to do a better job of covering people who live in places like where we live?
No, they haven't changed at all. And, you're right that there was some interest in it. Shortly after the election, I was invited to a lot of media conferences where people wanted to know, how do we better cover the red states, quote unquote. And, my answer is always hire people from the red states. We don't live in a world where you need to show up at an office, in New York City to write about life in Missouri or Ohio or wherever. And obviously you're going to get better and more rigorous and in-depth coverage if you're relying on people who actually live there and understand the social and political context and have contacts in the region. This is sort of just common sense. They were very opposed to this. One guy at PBS in particular, when I proposed this as the obvious solution, was, but we need smart people. We need smart people who know how to write, and he said that right to my face, knowing full well, I live in Missouri. And that's unfortunately the attitude of a lot of people who live in New York or D.C. And I really think it's a problem because local news is necessary, and local news in our region has been decimated since the recession. And I think a lot of, a way to build up the political trust that's also eroded since the recession is to, revive local reporting and kind of give people a framework of facts from which to, debate and reflect.
Yeah. I kind of turn to one of your recent Globe and Mail columns where you take a look at Donald Trump's first 100 days in office. And so what is your evaluation of President Trump now that you've had a chance to see him in action for a while?
He did essentially what I expected. The thing I thought was up for grabs was more how are citizens going to respond, and, what is the strength of our institutions? What's the strength of our checks and balances? And, I have mixed reviews. I think Trump is basically an autocratic, authoritarian-leaning individual who's operating in a flawed democratic system. So we still have these, checks and balances, but they're they've been flawed. And I think that the judiciary has proven stronger than I anticipated, though it's under threat. The media has proven weaker. They seem to fluctuate between actually investigating him in a meaningful way and, flattering him in a way that is reminiscent of coverage I see in places like Uzbekistan. And I think citizens have been very strong. I'm encouraged by the protests. I'm encouraged by the level of civic engagement and just the compassion people have shown for others. And all of that goes a long way towards trying to, be a counterbalance to the administration. But the administration is just as, cruel and just as unconstitutional and, just as terrible as I had envisioned it would be.
Right. So have there been any, would you say there's anything that surprised you? I mean, either in a not so pleasant way, or perhaps maybe even in a, wow, I didn't think he'd be that non-awful on that?
No, I mean, my only kind of things I was wondering about were, would he be able to pass these policies, which in many cases the answer so far has been no. And, there are kind of two types of autocratic rule that I think speak to how much power the autocrat believes he has. And you can see the difference in how blatant they are in their corruption, and in Trump's case, in their racism. I think the hiring of Steve Bannon into executive office, and his children for that matter, was just an incredibly blatant violation of, norms, and in the case of his children, of laws. They're not pretending to be a democratic government. They're not pretending to respect things like don't put neo-Nazis in the White House, or don't hire your unqualified children into, high security, high level positions. The things that would have been shocking for any other administration to do. They're doing that openly. And that's usually a sign that they believe they have a lock on power, that they're immune to prosecution, that they're immune to law. And that seems to be the case because there really hasn't been, there's been protests and complaints about these sorts of actions, but there's been no concerted effort to examine, the emoluments clause or other anti-nepotism clauses, or the fact that Jared Kushner, incorrectly filled out his security forms, which normally would cost you, your security access. That has not been followed up on, and that's a very bad sign. It shows that institutions aren't working, that checks and balances in these cases aren't working, and the more power they accumulate, and the more that it consolidates around the executive branch, the worse off, Americans are going to be.
I know you've done a lot of work on authoritarian states in your academic career. And so I'm wondering exactly, with Donald Trump, there's a lot of talk about how he admires what he'll call strong leaders, people who really take care of business, whether it's Egypt or Russia or the Philippines or what have you, people who I tend to see as just horrific human beings. But so I'm wondering what exactly differentiates, say, a strong leader from an authoritarian leader, and and how would you kind of put Donald Trump on this spectrum, I guess?
I mean, I would say Trump himself is not a strong leader in any way, because he tends to be unable to actually pass things into law. Like as I was saying, he's an autocrat operating in a democratic system that most of the time shoots him down in terms of actually passing initiatives or executive orders. Other countries are much more successful at that. And when you look at authoritarian states, there's a huge spectrum, and a lot of countries fall in, what's described as a semi-authoritarian state, something like Singapore might fall along those lines. I guess, no, Russia is more straight out authoritarian, but there's some states that what they tend to do is allow, a certain level of personal freedom, a bit more economic freedom, because they realize that benefits the economy. And then there are others like Uzbekistan, which is quite severe, which allows, no freedom of speech, no freedom of media, no freedom of commerce, no freedom, period. And we're not anywhere near that because we're coming out of a completely different tradition. And so for Trump to try to transform this country into, basically an authoritarian dynastic kleptocracy, which I think is his goal, particularly the kleptocracy part, a lot of things need to change. And he's been there for 100 days. It's not completely surprising that he hasn't managed to achieve this. But what I do worry is that he's going to use, typical authoritarian tactics of taking an emergency situation, something like a terror attack or an economic collapse, and using that as a pretext to issue some sort of clampdown on civil rights and on civil society that could have lasting repercussions. And we're not at that point yet. but I'm worried about it. Other people who study authoritarian states, like Timothy Snyder, are, worried about it as well. And so we're going to have to see, because that's going to be, the real challenge, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Timothy Snyder, because I know he has actually suggested not too long ago that it's inevitable that Donald Trump will try to stage a coup and overthrow democracy. And I read that, and it's like, this is not just some nut. This is a guy who's, a Yale historian and so forth. And so I'm wondering, what do you think about that? Is that a bit over the top, or is there something to that, would you say?
No, I think that's absolutely accurate. And in terms of people I would recommend, he's probably my number one recommendation, both for his historic works and for his analysis of Trump, which of course is grounded in his understanding of history. I do think that they're trying to, subvert the democratic process and, may come down to rewriting the Constitution, throwing away, laws that we've long taken for granted. There's certainly interest in that on his part. The question is, whether he'll use a show of force to try to carry off these initiatives, or whether he'll use the kind of pressure that he's been using, very well on the GOP and on other bodies that are supposed to, function as checks and balances on the system. And, we will become that sort of state on our own. I think it's very unfortunate that there hasn't been respect for constitutional processes. You see this kind of, blocking into things like the Russia investigation, which is a nonpartisan issue. It's a matter of national security and sovereignty. And unfortunately, those are not, the things that many members of the Republican Party are putting first. They're not putting country first. And when you don't do that, then, you are making yourself vulnerable. You may think that you're making your career and your own opportunities stronger, but that's always short-lived. That doesn't last long if the fundamental rules of how your government works are changed.
Right. I think certainly, I guess I would agree with you partly on the House side of those Russia investigations. It seems like it's become something of a farce, basically. But my sense of things is that on the Senate side, at least, there seems to be a show of bipartisanship, and there do seem to be at least some Republican senators. I'm thinking of people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham and a few others who seem to want to push back against some of President Trump's excesses. Do you hold out any hope that at least the Senate investigation might yield some sort of a fair and reasonable, just outcome?
I mean, I hope so. And I was very pleased that Graham and McCain were the ones, who introduced this idea. They were among the very first people to say, we need a serious investigation of this issue. I've tried to not have hope in people like John McCain, though, because when it comes down to things like, say, confirming, Rex Tillerson, who received an Order of Friendship Medal from Putin and is perhaps not the best choice as Secretary of State in this current environment, he went ahead and did so. The same is true of Rubio, of Graham, of others who have spoken out very forcefully about Putin and about the influence of the Kremlin on the election. I'd hope that they continue, to push for this investigation and that they treat it, with the seriousness and, integrity that it deserves. But we'll have to see what happens. I do agree, though, that the problem lies largely with the House Republicans. I think the Senate Republicans have been, more responsible and, more serious about the whole thing.
Right. So it sounds to me like what you're sort of saying is that while to this point, at least, there have been some institutions, I guess particularly the judiciary, who have pushed back at least somewhat against President Trump. Your concern is that he will create or sort of expand some sort of an international crisis and use that to kind of get into place some sort of emergency authoritarian powers, and it all kind of goes downhill from there. Is that more or less along the lines of what you're concerned about?
He could either create a situation or he can just let already existing situations fester. For example, in the economy, we're headed for a retail crisis. We're headed for what basically looks like an economic collapse. And a responsible government would be, taking initiatives to do something about this. So they don't even address it. So I think, it's partly that things could just not hold on their own. I do think we were in trouble as a country well before Trump got in. I think the economy was in trouble, our institutions were weakened, and they just need to exploit those factors rather than create one. But I also would not rule out, the idea that they may create one. We've seen this time and time again, with autocrats who, manufacture some kind of crisis. You saw it in Putin's Russia, for example, after he was elected. And it's a time-tested way to consolidate power. And so, I'm worried about it, on both those fronts.
And along the same lines, one of the things that some people might be concerned about, of course, is that as President of the United States, Donald Trump has the authority to launch nuclear strikes. And one of the things that you've argued is a concern, right, is that he's been obsessed with nuclear weapons for now over 3 decades. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what exactly this obsession of his is and what you see the most concerning about it.
Yeah, that worries me quite a bit because, as you know, Trump doesn't need congressional approval in order to launch a nuclear strike. This is something that's in his domain. Around the mid-'80s, Trump began to tell the press about his interest in nuclear weapons. He claimed he'd learned everything he needed to know about them in an hour and a half. He tried to meet, even though he was just a businessman, with various foreign officials to discuss his nuclear plans, including with Gorbachev. This meeting didn't actually happen. He's talked about how, if we have nukes, why aren't we using them? In the past, he's talked about how, using nuclear weapons on a country is a justified form of power. He fantasized about a post-nuclear Pakistan. He fantasized about dropping nukes on France. And he's not a stable and, kind of rational individual. I don't think he, understands the ramifications of just this rhetoric, which he's expressing towards North Korea. I think he understands in terms of policy. And I also think he has a fairly profound disregard for human suffering. I don't think he has any desire to want to avert human suffering. I'm not sure he sees other people as, full human beings. And that together with his access to nuclear weapons, is a very frightening combination.
Yeah, I could definitely see how someone would be concerned with that. So, I'm wondering how you would compare him to the last Republican president, George W. Bush. Now, Bush was a far more conventional president, but of course there was that war of choice in Iraq, which cost tens of thousands of lives, at least a few $1 trillion. And, you can argue it might have left the Middle East more destabilized than when he actually took office. And you throw in massive tax cuts that favor the rich, and you have what's kind of a liberal nightmare of a presidency. And certainly on I guess what some people might call aesthetic grounds. I mean, Trump is a sort of a vulgar guy that Bush really wasn't. But on policy grounds, I think some people wonder, can Trump really do any worse than that?
I mean, I think Trump absolutely can. That said, after Bush left office, I thought, well, there goes probably the worst president I'll see in my lifetime, which proved to be untrue as of this year. In terms of irresponsible military incursions that destabilize regions and cause the deaths of millions, yes, Bush is currently worse than Trump, but I think that, this is one of Trump's ambitions, and he has, neoconservatives in his administration, warmongers, as well as his own, feelings on that, where he, talks kind of casually about bombing the shit out of people. That's a direct quote. And he, strikes Syria for no particular strategic purpose, strikes Afghanistan for no purpose. The purpose seems to be to get applause and approval from the media. I don't think that that's the way that Bush operated. I think he was somebody who was surrounded by advisors who were able to, shape his policy. I don't think that Bush was a very curious person. I don't think he had a particularly strong understanding of what he's even doing in the presidency and, shouldn't have been there, honestly. But I don't think that he was sadistic. And I don't think that he was, so reckless that he would do something, for example, like inflame tensions with a nuclear power like Trump has been doing with North Korea. And, one of the key differences, though, is the domestic policies, Bush's immigration policy, the way that Bush, made sure to not denigrate Muslims. You can make a strong case that, he hurt, been killed, millions of Muslims, and that his policies were very anti-Muslim, both in terms of, foreign incursion and in, terms of surveillance within the United States. But he didn't have this, white supremacist, xenophobic, radical movement behind him, jumping on, turns of phrase like Trump makes against marginalized groups. And so with Trump, you have, a lot of potential for extreme violence abroad, but you also have potential for extreme violence within the United States from these sort of fringe parties, and he encourages it. He doesn't see it as his job to stop it. He sees his job as to cultivate it. And I think that that's the thing that really distinguishes him from somebody like Bush.
Right. You've mentioned a few times that some of the people in the Trump administration, and kind of along those lines, you actually recently got into what I thought was a pretty interesting Twitter exchange with Trey Orndorff, who's actually part of our Politics Guys team. It started, you tweeted, today Trump established Voice, which historians compare to Nazi initiatives, which isn't surprising as Nazis are in the White House. It's not Bush 2.0. And Trey responded, suggesting it was a poor analogy and it makes it even harder to criticize the program meaningfully. Things kind of went on from there. And I kind of wanted to get your take on what I see as the larger issue here is that the words and comparisons we use to describe Donald Trump, or as well as, his advisors and supporters. And it strikes me, in following your Twitter feed, you're pretty, no holds barred. You say it like you feel it, and I'm wondering what you see as the pros and maybe the cons of things like, for instance, Nazi comparisons and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, in that particular tweet, I wasn't making an analogy. Like, I was talking about an actual Nazi who was in the White House. And now they're sort of claiming he's leaving. But, Seb Gorka is a Nazi who is funded by our tax dollars to have an administration in, the highest levels of power. Steve Bannon is alleged to have, Nazi ties. And, even if he's not formally affiliated with the neo-Nazi movement like Gorka is, he certainly, has the beliefs and the, kind of idea of how, laws should be made and of, people's superiority or inferiority, based on how they were born or who they are as, Nazi leaders. That would be more of a comparative one. But in that case, like George W. Bush would not have put in this band of freaks, like Bannon, like Gorka, like Miller, like a lot of the more, radical elements of this administration. These are people who once existed on the fringes of U.S. politics and have now been pulled to the center, much in the same way that extremist rhetoric has become mainstream, to the point that when, Sean Spicer talks about Holocaust centers, it's a story that lasts, maybe half a day because some other horrific action that the administration does takes precedence. And so, my initial response on that tweet was to Chris Hayes, who also was saying, Trump's no big deal. He's just Bush 2.0. And, as I was just saying before, he's not. He's a lot worse. There are certain similarities. But, he's just worse in his intent, and he's much worse in terms of the people he surrounds himself with.
And so then it's sort of an issue of if you let this sort of thing go, or if you don't call a Nazi, I guess it's the concern about kind of normalizing this sort of thing is what I'm kind of hearing then.
Yeah, I think people have a sort of disbelief that there is a Nazi in the White House. This is a fairly rapid change. I would say like 4 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, we couldn't have imagined this scenario, and we certainly couldn't have imagined a scenario of, these individuals just sitting there, without being removed, there is mass outcry, but it doesn't seem to have much of an effect. The media treats it very much like a game. They treat it like it's a reality show. Is this guy in? Is this guy out? Instead of thinking about, what are the broader repercussions of the normalization of these sort of extreme people and of the idea of them being, legitimate actors in our government. Gorka, in addition to being a Nazi, has a fake PhD and no qualifications. This is just someone who there's no purpose for him to be there other than to legitimize Nazis and anti-Semitism as part of a mainstream, American directive that is approved by, the highest people in power. And as ridiculous as he is as an individual, it's a very frightening thing as a long-term phenomenon. And the longer that, we remain complacent and kind of think, okay, well, this guy's just kind of a whack job, and how, what are the ramifications for my life? We will find those ramifications. Something like the Voice Act, for example, is a policy that is reminiscent of Nazi Germany. And with Trump not being a rational actor, with him being surrounded by people who are more rational, but, who have, extremely xenophobic, extremely racist, and very anti-constitutional motives, there's really no telling how this is going to play out in a more permanent fashion, where it's not just rhetoric, but it's actual policies and law.
Right. Now, do you think that there's any benefit for progressives, for liberals to kind of break out of their silos and sort of seek out conservative, maybe even pro-Trump viewpoints and arguments? And I guess if you do, kind of to follow up on that, where would you say people would go for that? Because, for instance, I've tried reading Breitbart on more than one occasion, but it's just a hot mess, basically, I think, and it doesn't seem very helpful at all. So what do you think about that?
I think there's a difference. There's sort of three groups here. There's like conservatives, there are people who voted for Trump, and then there's Trump's base, which I would describe as something like Breitbart. And that base, I think, is extremely difficult to reason with. It's worth reading so that we kind of know, what they're thinking, what they're prioritizing, what moves the government might make. But, it's basically impossible to engage with them in a good faith argument. In terms of conservatives, I absolutely encourage progressives and liberals to read conservative writers who are thoughtful, who are, taking account of what's happening in this administration. There are conservative writers who I like Evan McMullin or Rick Wilson, both of whom are anti-Trump and both of whom hold other positions that I don't agree with at all. But, these are rational people, thoughtful people who care about their country and are, trying to, navigate its, political crises. And then the third group is really Trump voters. And, I live in Missouri, and, Missouri went for Trump. And I talked to a lot of Trump voters, not just as I was interviewing people as a reporter, but in everyday life. And a lot of them were not particularly enthusiastic about voting for Trump. They really hated Hillary Clinton, or they were pro-life, or they were lifelong Republicans. They had some other reason. And, those are folks that I think, are worth talking to, because, some of them who I've spoken to are frustrated with how the Trump administration has gone. They believed him about some of his promises on the economy and on other things, and they feel like they got a bad deal. And, I think that a voter is not the same as a fan. People often pick what they see as the worst of as the least of two evils. In this case, I strongly disagree that Trump was the least. I think, he was a nightmare. That said, if people are taking stock of the situation and, reconsidering it, I think those are very good people to have a conversation with and hear their perspective and, have them hear yours and see if there's points of, commonality.
Right. So kind of pulling back a little bit, what would you, given all you've seen in the last 100 days plus, what would you say is the biggest issue that's facing the United States, the Trump administration right now? And how do you feel they're likely to handle it, and maybe how they should handle it in a more perfect world?
Oh, man, there's so many issues. It's very hard for me to pick, because you can look at something like Obamacare and people losing it, and the fact that, they may well die or their children may die because of this. It's hard to sort of dismiss that. But if I were to just pick one thing that kind of encapsulates a lot of different problems that they're having, it's the emergence of kleptocracy as a system of government. It's, corruption embedded in the government. It's this dynasty that's forming from Jared and Ivanka being in positions of power where they're able to abuse them for personal profit, like Ivanka did recently with China, and her trademarks. it's Trump using, Mar-a-Lago, funding his own ventures with taxpayer dollars, profiting off of his hotels. He hasn't divested. He hasn't released tax returns. And then that all brings you back to the Russian interference problem, which I think is an incredibly severe problem. It's a threat to our national security. And that is related to his kleptocratic ambition. We don't know about his debt. We do know that he had, strong relationships with oligarchs. We do know that, despite his rhetoric being very inconsistent on other topics, Trump has been extremely loyal to Russia, extremely loyal to Putin. And I tend to think for Trump, this is less of an ideological matter than it is a matter of money, which is, his primary concern in life is money and fame and flattery. And so I think that if we examine kleptocracy as an issue, it encapsulates a whole bunch of problems that we've got going on.
Right. Let's, as we're kind of come to a close, I'm going to see if I can move things onto a slightly more positive note. At least I'll give it a shot. What would you say the United States is doing right as a country? I mean, ideally something maybe that our political system is doing well, or something we can point to with, some sort of justifiable pride.
Oh, I mean, I'm still proud of this country. I'm proud to be an American, as the song says, although I'm not particularly sure how free I am these days. I'm proud of citizens that are standing up for their rights, that are looking out for their communities, looking out for their neighbors, that are, taking it upon themselves to protect the things that are best about our country, our Constitution, our traditions of freedom and personal liberty, and trying to protect it from a government that seems hell-bent on transforming it. And so, when I see these acts of compassion, when I see these acts of concern, I'm very pleased by that. I'm also pleased by, some of our representatives. I think Maxine Waters in particular has been a great model of how, a person living in a democracy should behave when they're under the rule of an autocrat. She's been pushing back hard, and, Adam Schiff, Ted Lieu, others as well. So, Americans are managing to hang in there. This has been a very rough 100 days. I think it's been very shocking for a lot of people because it kind of thwarts their assumptions of how life should work. I think people take, fewer things for granted. They understand their rights better, and they're fighting for those rights. And so I just hope that people continue to do that, because our best bet is the people. No one's coming to save us from this. And institutions have eroded, but people still have the ability, to fight for themselves and on behalf of each other. And, I hope they continue to do so. Yeah,
absolutely. And of course, I hope they continue to do that right up until November of 2018, where I think a good turnout might do a lot of good to progressive causes. That's for sure. So,
assuming we have elections, yes, yeah. I hope so.
Now, one final question for you. Aside from following your work and your Twitter feed, which I definitely recommend people check out, where would you recommend Politics Guys listeners go to get kind of a fuller, deeper kind of understanding of politics, whether it's websites, journals, podcasts, books, what have you?
I mean, I always encourage people to read broadly, to investigate opinions that they might not agree with. But honestly, the biggest sort of weakness I've seen in people's understanding of what's happening is a lack of knowledge of history. And so I'd really encourage people to read up on autocracies, on authoritarianism around the world, both in the past and in sort of present analogs like Poland or Hungary or Turkey, and to look at systemic racism and brutal state tactics that have been practiced in the U.S. under law, slavery, Jim Crow, internment camps, the treatment of Native Americans. There's this attitude of, this can't happen here, we're America, we're a democracy, and, it has happened here, and it also happens elsewhere. And I think if you have an understanding of that, you can kind of predict better what the administration is doing. You understand it better, you'll understand that it's possible, and you'll know better how to fight. So I encourage everyone to go, go get their history books and learn a bit more about the world.
I think that's some great advice, actually. And with that, we will close. Sarah Kendzior, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
No, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you have any suggestions for future guests, or if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, or criticisms, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where we post throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. We'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the show and leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever podcast service you use. Sharing and retweeting our new show posts and tweets also helps out a lot. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do that through the PayPal or Patreon links on our website. We especially appreciate those monthly sustaining contributions through Patreon. They really do help out a lot. If you enjoy the show, you should check out the Politics Guys weekly newsletter. You can take a look at previous newsletters and sign up to have it delivered to your email inbox on our website, politicsguys.com. We'll be back with a new show next Wednesday. We hope you join us.